So we have 4 presenters tonight and 1 moderator. So representing Franklin Furnace Archive is Martha Wilson, who is the founder of the Franklin Furnace Archive. She founded it in 1976, and she is also a pioneering feminist artist, an art space organizer, and just all-around legend. So we're very excited to have her here with us tonight to talk about the history and the digital collections of Franklin Furnace. And representing Interference Archive, we have 2 members of their volunteer staff. We have Jen Hoyer, who is a librarian with the Brooklyn Public Library and has been with Interference Archive since 2013, I think. Yeah. And she has run programs and exhibitions and events with them since, and she will explain, they will both explain a little bit about how that all-volunteer force works. And also representing them is Rob Smith, who is also a librarian, and he has been working, you've done several exhibitions as well with Interference Archive, and he has done several podcast shows. So I would love to hear more about what's audio interference, it's the podcast, so add that to your feed. And finally, and I don't think I've ever gotten to introduce you, we have Jane Nebel Boy, who is the chair of the board of directors in Hong Kong and New York for the Asia Art Archive. Prior to that, she was the deputy director of the Guggenheim Museum, and she has a book published by Brill in 2014 called The Teen State and the Market, Chinese Contemporary Art in the Post-Mao Era. And finally, our moderator and really the instigator of this program tonight is Meghan Forbes, who is the CMAP Fellow at the Museum of Modern Art and also a visiting scholar at the Institute for Public Knowledge at NYU. And her book that was recently published in 2019 is International Perspectives on Publishing Platforms, and I can read it because it's right behind her head right here. So I encourage you all to go check it out later, and that is looking at archives as part of it, and also publishing and published materials as it relates to material culture. So Meghan approached us about organizing this event, and so we're very excited to have her kick us off with her introduction to the talk. So please welcome Meghan.
Much to Hillary and Jane and Asia Art Archive also for hosting and participating in this conversation. And thank you to Rob and Jen from Interference Archive, especially on that evening when you have your own exhibition opening. And thank you, of course, to Martha, who's representing Franklin Furnace here. And my relationship with the Asia Art Archive is thanks to a conference that I organized in May 2017 at the Institute of Public Knowledge at NYU, and at which Hillary was in attendance. The purpose of that conference was to talk about periodicals and other forms of print and digital media, alongside a consideration of the archive to discuss how we might make visible what is literally not there, i.e. material gaps in the archive and also in libraries. In her keynote talk, Barnard Zine librarian Jenna Freeman, as I recall, raised the point that the title of the conference, Summoning the Archive, inadvertently risks suggesting that the archive is this static, latent place just waiting for scholars to come in and make use of it. And likewise, New School professor Kate Eichhorn, in her book The Archival Turn in Feminism, urges her fellow scholars to consider, quote, the intellectual and practical challenges, unquote, that go into creating and maintaining the archive. In short, to think about the production of the archive itself. This has become a common refrain in certain circles, and it's no news here, of course, that archives are dynamic, fluid spaces, and it takes the work of many to manage and catalog and make accessible their collections. So I'm truly delighted to have had the opportunity to bring together here a group of people who are doing that work, and as the 2.0 title for this event suggests, are integral in activating the archive. Of course, there are many different types of archives that run the gamut from bureaucratic governmental lair to the personal archives of an deceased artist or writer, may be kept in the house of a relative, and perhaps equally impenetrable. Most archives, though, fall somewhere in between. They might be institutional archives or community archives, or to use a term that Jen Hoyer used in the text she co-authored about the Interference Archive, counter-hegemonic archives. The archives I use most often are those connected to art institutes and museums in Prague and Berlin, In New York, I sit just outside the archive at MoMA nearly every day from my perch in the library, where I typically choose a chair with a view through the glass door, separating the two spaces so that I can peek in at all those cartons of mysterious materials that researchers have indeed summoned, and which the archive staff have so neatly and diligently prepared. And this glass door, I think, between the two study spaces is maybe a metaphor for the kind of slippage between the archive and the library that maybe we can discuss later this evening. Pushing further, the concept of the archive can be extended to consider not only the physical site of the archive, but also that which is cited there. So, for instance, the object as archive and archived object. The scholar Maria Cabrera Aruz, a contributor to the volume that I recently edited, exemplifies this with her web-based project Cuba Material that figures the legacy of Soviet-era socialism in Cuba through a vast collection of photographs, documents, and everyday items of use. Her digital archive of, quote, appliances, furniture, clothing, ephemera, and memorabilia has become the largest repository of material culture of Cuban socialism, end quote. The objects, viewable online collectively, and on occasion in the material world of exhibition spaces, such as at the Parsons School of Design in 2015, helped to construct a narrative of everyday life under a specific period of Cuban socialism by circumventing the restrictive state archive. Another contributor to that volume, Camilla Salvaneschi, takes the objectness of the art magazine and theorizes it as a self-consciously self-archiving publishing practice. She uses this model to think about the role that print publication can play for online or physical archive and library spaces, such as Chimurengo Library and also the Asia Art Archive, that reflect back or hold up the archival process. Salvaneschi asks, how does the magazine use the archive as a site of network formation? And the question could also be asked the other way around. I'm sure that the conversation to follow the coming presentations, we will have much to discuss about this productive triangulation between the physical archive space, its digital strategies, and its approaches to creating print-based publications. To offer one more local example, the work of librarian and archivist Shanta Smith exemplifies this sort of productive exchange between the physical and printed archive and embodies the archivist as activist. Smith has created a zine to encourage Black lesbians to donate their collections to the Lesbian History Archive that provides not only information about the archive, one could say it is an archive of the archive, and contact information to schedule a consultation, but also, and sort of ingeniously, a list for potential donors to, quote, add stuff I'm going to donate to the archive. And I have my own copy here, and I'm happy to pass this around. You can look inside and see this list that encourages potential donors to the archive to sort of activate this zine. That quote stuff can include letters, emails, birthday cards, photographs of friends, lovers, and family, your unpublished poetry and prose. Objects objects that are much like those included in Cabrera Aruz's Cuba Material. So archives can be built and histories narrated out of the objects of the everyday. Eichhorn writes that, quote, rather than a destination for knowledge already produced or a place to recover histories and ideas placed under erasure, the making of archives is frequently where knowledge production begins, end quote. Over the years living in New York, I have been very interested in and inspired by the role of librarians and activists in this making, creating and maintaining spaces that reflect certain histories and stories that are not held for safekeeping in other institutions. I think that the Brooklyn-based organizations we will learn more about tonight are three such examples of this. So I look forward to the conversation about the work of the archive and archivists in documenting local community while participating in its formation and preservation. I'm eager to discuss how these archives at the same time extend their reach through exhibition, performance, print, publication, and digital platforms, or in the case of Franklin Furnace, perhaps the question is better put as to how the archive preserves and reflects performance, exhibition, and so forth. And here also maybe there's an important distinction we can work out of the conversation between, as Jen draws out, activist archive and archiving activism. I want to talk about how you all engage the gaps in the archive, either in your own or in others, and address what Jared Drake recently called at the Ethics of the Archive Symposium at Barnard in February, the quote, racialized, gendered, and class dynamics of the archive. But for now, I will be quiet and hand over the floor to you all, and I'm happy to invite up first Martha from Franklin.
I founded Franklin Furnace in my Tribeca living loft in 1976 to champion ephemeral art forms neglected by mainstream institutions, especially artist books, contemporary installation art, and performance art. I started by collecting artist books such as Lawrence Wiener's Statements, published in pocket size and sold for $1.98 to make it cheaply available to anyone, a democratic art form. Because the type of this text is set in the form of a brick, word and image intersect in the idea of the artist. And are these not instructions for a performance? In fact, when I founded Franklin Furnace in 1976, I invited artists to read to the public. The term artist books did not yet exist as yet to describe contemporary and cheap publishing by artists. The term artist books did not exist yet to describe contemporary and cheap publishing by artists. Every single artist chose to manipulate the performative elements, light, sound, relationship to the audience, props, costume, and time as part and parcel of the work. The misnomer performance art had not yet taken hold either. The word in vogue at the time was piece, which encompassed the thought, the action, the documentation, drawn or photographed or filmed or published or taped, whatever. At this time, everybody was doing everything. Playing in bands, publishing broadsides, doing street actions, slinging audio tape across the ceiling, having a wonderful time. Performance art, in my view, is the opposite of theater, which holds, according to Samuel Taylor Coleridge, the willing suspension of disbelief as its objective. Performance art has raided literature, music, dance, and theater traditions, while theater has borrowed from performance art conventions, spreading confusion. But in general, performance artists remind their audiences, there is no artifice here. This is happening now, in real time. Because it is embedded in the body, performance art takes time itself to be its primary object. Teaching Shay's one-year performances, during which he, for example, lived in a cage, punched a time clock every hour, lived outside, was tied to another person, and did no art, placed the body's expenditure of time at the center of the idea. These are photographs of his installation at Franklin Furnace in 1983. Photographs of him summer, winter, spring, and fall. These are the clothes that he wore while he lived outside for 1 year. And these are 365 maps of Lower Manhattan, where he slept, where he woke up, where he took a bath in a hydrant, where he walked. During the 80s, avant-garde artists lost their place as the darlings of American culture, allowed to experiment wildly and freely. Gradually, the administration of Ronald Reagan and conservative religious groups promulgated the idea that artists were the virus eating away at the health of the body politic. In 1984, Franklin Furnace exhibited Carnival Knowledge, curated by 9 women artists and activists who asked if there was such a thing as feminist pornography, or pornography which didn't denigrate women and children. The Carnival Knowledge Feminist Performance Collective invited Annie Sprinkle, a porn star, and the members of her porn star support club, Club 90, to participate in their January event at Franklin Furnace. The performance itself was entitled Deep Inside Porn Stars, It involved tea and cookies and sought to remind the audience that sex workers are mothers, daughters, wives, and women just like their feminist counterparts. It was at this event that Annie Sprinkle changed her identity from porn star to performance artist, contrasting the persona of Ellen Steinberg, a fat girl raised in Southern California, with Annie Sprinkle, a gorgeous porn star who lives in New York. We also had mud wrestling. Does anybody know Jennifer Miller, the bearded lady? She's the one on the right. Saxophone dancing. Boobs and more boobs. After Carnival Knowledge closed at the end of January, the Morality Action Committee swung into action, writing postcards to elected officials and letters to Franklin Furness's corporate and foundation supporters, claiming that we had shown pornography to 500 children per day. As a result of the culture wars in which this was an early skirmish, the work of especially performance artists became politically impossible, and the individual artist fellowship program of the National Endowment for the Arts was killed off. During its 20th anniversary season, Franklin Furnace reinvented itself as a virtual institution, not identified with real estate, but rather with its resources made accessible by electronic and other means. The organization made this decision in the wake of the culture wars of the 80s and 90s in order to provide artists it was presenting with the same freedom of expression possible in the loft in the 1970s. At the end of William Popel's residency at Franklin Furnace in the summer of 1991, he performed "How Much Is That Nigger in the Window?" He was pretty much butt naked, except for his jockey shorts, sitting on a platform in our storefront window on Franklin Street. During the performance, he smeared mayonnaise on his skin in an attempt to become white. The mayonnaise oxidized, becoming transparent, revealing William's black skin. I asked him about his choice of materials, and he cited the futility of attempting to reconstruct one's social condition. What is brownness as opposed to whiteness? Mayonnaise gave me a quirky material means to deal with issues black people claim they don't value very much, e.g. whiteness. Popel's crawl pieces literally place the body in the position of homeless people, taking it out of the vertical posture representing power, forcing him and his unwitting audience to look at bodies that have been rendered invisible. The contradiction he uses to focus us upon his body in Tompkins Square Park crawl, which would be unremarkable in tattered clothes, was a very nice three-piece suit. "This black man is in a suit crawling in the gutter in the Bowery," another black man told him to get up because he was degrading the image of black people. Excuse me. Franklin Furnace has had an indelible impact upon launching the careers of artists whose work has influenced art and cultural discourse. Franklin Furnace has no curator. Each year, a new panel of artists reviews all proposals to the Franklin Furnace Fund. We believe this peer panel system allows a diverse array of artists an equal opportunity to present their work in New York. Franklin Furnace grants have helped launch the careers of artists of color, gay and transgender artists. We believe this success is due to the composition of Franklin Furnace's peer panels, representing a diverse range of practice, ethnic and cultural background, sexual preference, age and physical ability, as well as familiarity with new technology. Franklin Furnace's fund grants have helped to diversify the contemporary avant-garde. Fund grants are made annually to emerging artists to enable them to do their first major works in New York. From 2010 to 2015, 35% of our fund grant recipients identified as other than white. 2015-16, the class of 14 fund recipients, 6 artists, collaborations, or 42% were of color. In 2016-17, the percentage of artists of color increased to 50%, and in 2017-18, 8 of 12 artists, or 66%, were of color. And in 2018-19, 6 of 7, or 85% of the artists were of color. This is the last show in our physical space. After this, we went virtual, and we will talk about what happens when you do that. The end. Thank you.
So while Rob finds our slides, I'll just say hi. And one thing that's really important for us as an organization whenever we are representing ourselves in public is to try our best to have at least 2 people present to really represent the fact that we are an all-volunteer collective that has a lot of different people, a lot of different ideas doing this work together. So we're grateful that you all have made space and grateful that Asia Art Archive and Meghan made space for 2 of us on this panel to represent the work that we do. We are only 2 of a very large group.
Okay, so let's begin. What is Interference Archive? Interference Archive is an archive of social movement material. We're volunteer run, as Shin mentioned, community supported, and open access. We've been around since 2011, first in a warehouse space in Gowanus, and recently we moved to a storefront location at Park Slope. In case you didn't know where Park Slope was. That is our new space.
Nice.
Our mission is to explore the relationship between social movements and the mass-produced materials they create. We work to preserve and honor the histories and material culture that is so often marginalized in mainstream spaces and put those narratives back in the hands of the public, among people who can then use it as a tool to inspire the current and future generations to use it for good. As a group of, more than just building an archive, we're building a community that does not work under the guise of neutrality, but instead believes in the power of the people to confront systemic oppression. As a group of friends, co-conspirators, activists, artists, archivists, librarians, we've amassed a formidable collection of materials from grassroots movements and have become one of the largest archives of its kind in the country.
So what's in our archive? We collect material produced by social movements around the world, and we focus on material produced in multiples for widespread distribution. So that means we don't collect organizational records, we don't collect personal papers, we don't collect artwork. There are different reasons for all of that, but a lot of it goes back to being an open access collection. And in being open access, we want people to be able to come in and look through any of the boxes, and we understand the privacy concerns that come with a lot of personal papers, a lot of organizational records. So if we focus on things that were intended to be distributed, intended to be passed around, we feel like those are the best things to have in our space that is really openly accessible. Our collection includes things like comics, posters, a few books, pamphlets, t-shirts, buttons, stickers, and it really covers social movements around the globe. We regularly receive donations of material from all over the world, from people who are traveling through New York City and say, I'm here from Zimbabwe, but my friend in South Africa asked me to bring you this. We have no budget for our collection, so everything is donated. And I would say that since we started in 2011, there was a founding collection of material from our group of 4 founders, but since we started, that's at least doubled, if not tripled, in size, with some really huge donations, as well as people who walk in and hand us one sticker. It all ends up in the archive. In terms of the time frame of our collection, most of it is post-World War II, really the 60s onward, but we do have stuff going back to the very start of the 20th century, as well as a tiny bit from the end of the 19th century. When you think about material that was produced in multiples for widespread distribution, a lot of that is printed on really cheap wood pulp that's high in acid, and it was never meant to last very long. So it's hard to find things at this point that come even from the first half of the 20th century that have lasted, that were made in that kind of format. So I mentioned the types of privacy restrictions that really restrict what we take, but we also don't take material that is really damaged in any way. If something comes in and it's got mold on it, or it's just going to need a lot of repair work. We know, first of all, that we don't have the capacity to repair things in the way that maybe they might need to be, so then we'll try to direct folks to places that can do that work. We understand our limitations as an all-volunteer space, and as a space that focuses on letting folks handle stuff. We don't want to have things that are too fragile to be handled. And we also make sure that if we take something and we see signs of mold, we don't want that because it could damage the rest of our collection before we could figure out anything to do with it. So those are really the parameters around everything that we keep.
So as Shin said, our guiding principle is just sort of that, for us, use is preservation. So whether it's a mindful toddler looking through a box of materials or a bumbling adult, anyone can handle the material. But we engage with people not only through being able to pull things out of files, but by inviting them to our exhibitions and class visits. So here it's a group of, I think this was a high school visiting us, but we bring in high school students, college students, people from institutions around the country, locally, and occasional foreign visitors as well. We also host exhibitions. Exhibitions are a great way for us to expand our collection, because we'll often start with a seed of an idea based on material that's in the collection, and then go out and try to borrow or collect material, receive donations really, that's related to the topic. So that way it's a way for people to not only realize that, oh, we have things on tenant organizing at Interference Archive, but just come and see the space. We also produce, often as a way to mark those exhibitions, different publications. In this case, this not only tells you the history of tenant organizing in New York, but it's also a handbook in case anyone wants to become a tenant organizer themselves. So this, we're still selling it, so it lasts well past a show. We also host public events, including this Wikipedia edit-a-thon and propaganda parties. Propaganda parties are an opportunity for us to create new propaganda, posters, t-shirts, buttons en masse around a current topic. We have one coming up at the end of this month out of May Day. And of course, digitally, we have a digital catalog that's currently under construction, but it offers a glimpse into just a fraction of what is available on site. We also host, as mentioned, a podcast called Audio Interference. The idea for Audio Interference started as an oral history project. People would come by, drop off stickers, boxes, whatever, and then just sort of run away before we got a chance to get a history of the materials. But once we realized oral history had too many stipulations, we turned it into a podcast instead. And while many of our episodes do still deal with donations, they've expanded to cover topics that are related to the interests of our constituency, be it sex workers' rights or war veterans that are now anti-war, bail reform, you name it. We've done a lot of things. Yeah.
So how do we do all of this? As a volunteer community, I think there's two really key things that keep us going. So first of all, in terms of labor, volunteer labor, there's a huge community of people who make everything possible. We're open to the public 4 days a week, Thursday through Sunday. And then, as Rob mentioned, we do all these other things like exhibitions and events, and we host class visits. As a community of volunteers, there's, I would say, 50 to 60 active volunteers, and we organize ourselves non-hierarchically in a way that is very similar to many of the social movements represented in our collections. We use different working groups to focus on different things. So there's a working group of staffers, there's a working group that does the podcast, there's a working group that does cataloging, there's an education working group, a born digital working group, an admin working group that pays the bills. And all of that makes it possible. Really, we couldn't exist without our community of volunteers. the other real pillar of our work is the financial support that we receive from our community, and we're really committed to a financial model that is rooted in our community. So first of all, since the archive started, we have had a sustainer model where people give $10, $50 a month towards this work. That was rooted in something that I think is a really important legacy for us as an archive. It came out of a health fund that was established for one of the founders who passed away shortly after the archive was started. And many of the people who had been giving monthly to that health fund asked for that support to be transferred over to the archive. So coming out of that legacy of care, I think is really powerful for an organization that is more than an organization, it's really a community. And that financial model, I think, brings people into our community. All of those financial supporters are helping us in this work, maybe because they would love to volunteer, but they live out of town or they are really busy with their work, they can't show up, so they sign up to give $10 a month. And then beyond that sustainer program, we all of our events are free, but we put out a donation jar at all of our events, and folks understand that when they come in, if they put some money in the jar, it really just helps keep a roof over the head of this collection and this community space. And then we receive donations for class visits. We understand that to be a really equitable transfer of resources. When classes come to our institution, it's often because we have material they can't see at their collection. They don't have access maybe in the same manner to the archives at their institution, so they come to us. But we know that they have access to money in a way that we don't have, so we can do each other a favor there. I think that's a great way of cross-institutional cooperation. Aside from that, we do receive some small grants towards extra programming, but we really do try to keep our operational costs covered through the community that makes all of this work. It keeps us accountable for what we're doing. And so that wraps up our introduction. We will give a short plug for the exhibition that's opening tonight and open through late June 23rd. There will be a lot of really terrific events related to this exhibit, organized by folks from the Poor People's Campaign here in New York City, highlighting their historic work, their current organizing, etc. And you can keep in touch with us in lots of ways. But I think we'll hand it over.
First of all, I am so honored to have Interference Archive and Martha and the Franklin's Furnace here today to present. It's interesting to talk about Brooklyn-based archives and Brooklyn-based organizations. Our organization here is Brooklyn-based, and yet we have our mothership, which is actually in Hong Kong. So we're a bit of a split in that respect, and I think what I'm going to do today is talk about what we do here, but also what we do there, because it's completely, utterly intertwined and connected. First of all, my name is Jane Nebel Boy, and I'm the chair, as Hillary explained, of Asia Art Archive, both here and in Hong Kong. I've been with the organization. We were founded in 2000, and I've been the chair for most of that time. So we've gone from a few books on a bookshelf to 2 locations, and in fact we have an office in Delhi, in India as well, for various reasons. But our focus, here's a picture of Asia Art Archive. It's a collage. Here in America, but our activities are similar but slightly different in both locations. Here we're a library, or what we call a reading room. We're not a credited library. In order to be a library, it's actually something that is officially has to be accredited by the Department of Education, I believe. We are a reading room here, open to the public, free of charge, 5 days a week. And we have a library in Hong Kong as well that is actually very large, again, open to the public 6 days a week, free of charge. Our We also have a very large digital archive. We have some physical materials, but we were born in 2000 and sort of at the beginning of the digital moment. And most of our material is available in digital form. We can talk about that and the commitment there, but that is a huge commitment that we have made to make material accessible to the widest possible audiences. We also are a platform for conversations such as this in Hong Kong as well as here. We do workshops, we host performances, performance artists come. We have residencies for artists and curators who come and work with us. We also give some grants for curators and scholars. But I just want to give a little sense of our collection. First of all, as you can see here and there, our focus is contemporary art in Asia, made in Asia, but also made by Asians here in outside of the United States, outside of Asia. And we have probably at this point the largest collection of reference materials and secondary materials about art from Asia, including some very rare materials. These are exhibition catalogs from China of foreign exhibitions that went to China in the 50s and 60s and 70s. Again, we have a very wide assortment of periodicals published in Asia. Again, this is an assortment of periodicals, many of which were censored and are no longer available, even in China. But these are art periodicals from China, and some very rare examples. Here's some self-published exhibition catalogs in the 1990s after Tiananmen. A lot of the public art in public spaces was extremely limited, and artists started to work on their own in these kind of do-it-yourself formats. And we have a very wide collection of those, and very interesting. And again, we have lots of primary documents. And this material we have, as I said, some physical material, but most of it is available in digital form. We've made a huge commitment there. I've scanned an enormous amount of material, and that's available in large part on our website. Not all of it. There are a lot of privacy concerns, and there are also a lot of copyright concerns. But we have a lot available for on-site, and we have on-site access here. So there's material available on our website. There's material available on-site here, and then there's other material waiting to be processed, which is always a challenge. What I thought I would do is kind of connect Asia to Brooklyn and Brooklyn to Asia by using one case study. And then I would talk a little bit about India. But Meghan asked us to think about some questions. One is how we position ourselves locally, as well as within the wider field, and that's a actually interesting challenge for us who have two locations in very different environments. How do we address marginal voices, gaps in the historical record? How do we ensure the invisible becomes and stays visible? How do we even know something's there? How do you find the unknown unknowns? How do we activate the archive? I think we've all going to talk about that, and I think all of us share a very similar ethos in that respect. There's no point in hoarding material. There's no point in hiding material. It's all about making it accessible and activating that material so it itself can produce new knowledge, new ideas, and communities, I think, importantly, communities of kindred spirits who can go out and make change in whatever way that community or that individual would like. In New York, as I said, I think it's somewhat uncontroversial to say that art made in Asia or made by Asians in America is still underrepresented and underexposed in this very cosmopolitan international city. Asia, as we know, is 60% of the world's population. It's a very vibrant part of the world. It has an extremely vital art scene, and yet there's still a real dearth of opportunities to engage that here in New York. And so that is what we do here. We're one of the few nonprofit organizations that focus exclusively on contemporary practice. Then I go to Hong Kong, and I go back and forth all the time, and it's a bit interesting because when I get to Hong Kong, obviously Asians are not underrepresented in Hong Kong. But every geography has its own hierarchies, its own systems of power that privilege and support certain communities and certain kinds of practice, art practice included, over others. And so in order to guide our efforts in Asia and in New York, and as I said, Asia's vast, and we can talk about how we define it and how we, how do we engage that enormous area. But we've developed certain initiatives, or certain what we call content priorities, to question these kinds of imbalances and to address the gaps that we have identified. Those content priorities are like sort of like a compass that we carry around with us. For example, we have identified in Asia that there is a certain or a very strong underrepresentation, particularly in certain parts of Asia, of women or in the histories. Interestingly, performance art, which is one of really fascinating area of art practice in Asia for many, many reasons, is one that, as we all know, hard to document and collect, preserve, and therefore it is very underrepresented in any of the institutional structures, if there are any institutional structures at all. When we started in 2000, there were no contemporary art museums in China. Now there are multiplicity of contemporary art museums in China in the intervening 20 years. But again, those institutions are not necessarily showcasing performance, and actually performance in China is still something that, or activities in public spaces that gather crowds are still something that are quite sensitive in a place like China. But in places like Southeast Asia and India, there's a lot of work in that sphere, a lot of activist work in that sphere that melds or merges the borders between art and activism, art and performance. And yet the private museums and much of the new activity in the contemporary space are private museums or art fairs or art organizations that are showcasing art that is commodifiable. Performance is something that has not and will not probably be seen in any kind of large way in those arenas. So that is a very strong focus of our work. Other kinds of things that we focus on is art activities that are happening outside of central cities. So much of what we see takes place in the large cities in Asia as well as in New York City, frankly. And so what is happening outside those cities? Huge populations are there. There are very interesting art fields. We spend a lot of time trying to address that gap. And art writing. We focus a lot on art writing, and one of the issues, again, I will talk a little bit about this, but for example, India. I don't know if you know how many languages there are spoken in India. By some tallies, it's 150 languages are spoken by more than 10,000 people. There are 22 official languages in China, in India. And we're going to talk about a project that we're working on presently to make art writing in languages other than English and Hindi more accessible and available. Activating the archive, we can talk about that in more things, but I'm going to use this example, which is, and two examples I'm going to use, one in India and one in China, to kind of amplify or illustrate the things I've just said. Here is a archive that we identified here in Brooklyn. It was a collection, as we say, what do we mean by archive? It was a collection of materials that was in the hands of this woman, Betsy Damon, who in the 70s was a feminist performance artist working in New York. And then in the 80s, she had an epiphany, and she decided to dedicate the rest of her life to water and pollution preservation, raising awareness about water issues and water protection. She founded an organization called Keepers of the Water, and for various reasons, she ended up in China at the end of the 80s and early 90s and organized 2 festivals. Now, as I was talking about, what is interesting about this archive is there are many, many things. Fascinating work was done in these 2, and we can show some slides. But again, most of the work that you see from Asia, whether you're in Asia or whether you're in New York, comes from 3 major cities, Beijing, Shanghai, and Shenzhen. This is China. But the 2 festivals that she organized in the mid-1990s, one was in Chengdu, the other one was in Lhasa, Tibet. Again, places where even experts of China, people who've studied China for a long time, know very little about, and the art activities were happening in those areas. So here is some photographs from her personal collection, which she has now donated to Asia Art Archive, and we have digitized and made a lot of this material available. Here's a parade in a public space in 1999 in China. The narrative is that public space was closed in China after Tiananmen, and art, such as performance art or any kind of experimental activity, was limited, if not drastically curtailed. This runs against that narrative, and it's very interesting to a lot of us, and not very few of us knew this even existed. She brought a group of scientists to test water quality in a river in Chengdu. Here is a handwritten poster that she created, asking the community in Chinese to come and tell stories about the river and their experiences with this river that ran through this major city. Chengdu is a major city in Sichuan of many millions of people. She worked with the local artists as well as some artists who came with her to wash silk in the river. Clearly the silk didn't come out as white when it came out as when it went in. Worked with local artists, again, about doing interventions and installations and performances in the public space to talk about water standards. More worked with the roads, having people hanging things off the roads. This is a beautiful piece done by a gentleman whose otherwise name is Da Jiang, washing or cleaning the river with brooms. Here's a very famous piece, in fact, by an artist named Song Dong. He's one of the artists who've actually started to circulate at the international level. Here's a photograph. It's been collected by, I think, even MoMA and the Museum of Metropolitan Museum, where he's using a large wooden stamp to stamp the water. No, I did not know, and I've known this speech for a long time, that in fact it happened in the context of this festival in 1996 in Lhasa. And here he is stamping the water from a very different angle than what you see in the photographs, which is fascinating from this archive. Here's another work, this is a woman artist. One of the exciting things that came out of this is not only were we seeing work happening in parts of China that are not normally showcased, but this is a work by a woman artist. Again, there were quite a number of women in her archive, where she built a a cube out of ice, river water ice blocks, and then invited the public to wash them. Of course, they ended up melting. But here's a wonderful piece called Washing River, and inviting the local passers-by to wash this river, wash this ice. Obviously, the ice at the end of the day melted. It's very hot in Sichuan in the middle of summer when this happened, leaving a very brown, dirty stain on the sidewalk. But there is interesting, not only photographs, but footage. Here's another piece by a woman artist who, again, we had never met, knew about before we went into this archive, where she put silk on the sides of the river in. Another artwork filling shoes with yak butter. Again, Tibetan artists. Here's a performance by a group of Tibetan artists. Again, we're trying to find the names of all of them, although they, from what Betsy talked about, was that they gathered 90 kids and other people in the community to set up these crosses onto which these t-shirts were put and then were hung, and then lanterns were hung on the edges of them, and as the night got darker, all you could see were the lanterns. Again, I don't think anyone's ever really focused on the fact that there was this kind of community-based participatory art work being done in Tibet at that point in time, and even now it's not well known. Here are the list of artists that we have uncovered through this. It's a long list. Many of the names are unfamiliar to most people in the field, and this information is now available on our website. You can go there. India. There are two areas. Obviously, two of the largest countries in the world are in Asia, one India, one China. India is a very large country, and as I said, has 22 official languages. Here's a map of those official languages. We embarked on a project recently where we were looking at art writing and began to clearly understood that much of what we all in India as well as elsewhere look at in terms of writing about India is in English. English is spoken by the educated class in India and widely throughout India, but most of the writing was in English and some in Hindi, and we decided to think about, again, the unknown unknowns, what is being written in other languages and how does it compare. So we embarked on this bibliography project where we were looking at, we did sort of a relay around India, worked with different libraries, different archives to map and create a bibliography of art writing in different languages. And here we can see that we've mapped them. English obviously still is a very large part of the work being done in art writing, but of course there are multiple other languages. For example, as I was talking about before, here's a list of writers in the Mumbai area that we knew about, and after this project, here was the list of writers that we had discovered and are in the process of listing. So, what is it that we don't know? How do you find what we don't know? And then how do we socialize this, or how do we activate this? How do we make this available in different forms for other people? And this is one of the projects we were talking about, publications. We do online publications as well as exhibitions, as all of you do. We do workshops and symposiums and bring people together. But one of the things that we struggle with, frankly, or I struggle with more than anybody else in the organization, but what is the role of hard copy publications? And through this exercise, this bibliography project, what we realized is that, again, much of what is written is in English or in Hindi, but a very large part is in English. How do we make visible that which art writing or writing about art that's not in English? Translation is obviously a huge part of that. So we came up with the idea of creating 3 different volumes or 3 different collections of writing. This one was the first one we did. It talks about writing about the imagination of what an artist is by different authors, some art writers, some artists, and some short story writers and poets. And this language, they come in 7 different languages that we translated and have created this. The one on the last, which is the last one we're doing, is travelogues by artists, art writers, and other. And again, it's a compilation of things we found in through this bibliography project, as well as additional research, as well as archives, and that we've translated them and made them available. So I'm going to stop there, and we're going to talk. Meghan, I think, is going to ask us questions. Correct? Thank you.
all of you for those interesting presentations, and I hope this is maybe more of a conversation than me asking you formal questions, and we all. But perhaps a nice place to start is with the idea of exhibition, because all of you are engaging with this in different ways, either here in your physical spaces or through performance. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you see this relationship between exhibition and archive. Yeah, start there and open up to whoever would like to.
Luckily for me, Jenny Corns is here. Jenny Corns is the person who takes care of the digital record of the performances and installations and whatever. When we went virtual, we were doing it at a time when the internet was being born, and we started thinking about how to organize the material and decided to do it by event. So the event is the central idea. So if Karen Finley got a grant, did an installation, and did a performance, those are 3 different events. We're not putting everything under Karen Finley's name. We use FileMaker Pro, which is off-the-shelf digital asset management system, and now we're gonna put everything. We're unhappy that here's the thing. If you Google Anna Mendieta, let's say, Franklin Furness's website doesn't come up. You have to know that she did a performance at Franklin Furnace, and then you can go into the event record and find her performance. So we're starting the process this summer of converting everything into Content DM, which is available worldwide, and you'll be able to Google Anna Mendieta, which makes me very happy. I am not a person who ever went to, we're located now on the campus of Pratt Institute. Jenny went to Pratt Library School, and so she's really the one who ought to be talking instead of me. What do you want to add to this discussion?
I guess we've already started the process of moving a lot of our digitized video content over to Content DM, which is a big improvement from how we had it before, which was just through Vimeo, which was okay for a while, but it became even difficult to search within Vimeo for specific artists or videos. You had to search the entirety of Vimeo, not just within Franklin Furnace. So that's exciting. Yeah, that's...
It's expensive and it takes forever.
When I talk about the commitment that we made to, and that's exactly the issue, the commitment to digital. I think in the early days there was a lot of sense that this was going to be, the solution to everything, and that it was going to replace a lot of costs and bring down. And it's really not true.
No.
And the kinds of frustrations that you're feeling about the systems, the things that it's constant, but it's a huge commitment, and it's a huge commitment not just in terms of the technical infrastructure, but scanning is a physical exercise that takes humans, and then annotating and ensuring that it's accurate and getting the permissions. These are physical exercises of labor that's put in by human beings. And that obviously all costs a lot of money, and it's really important, and you have to be specialized in this in order to get it correct. So it's a big commitment. It's a huge commitment. I don't think anyone should take it on lightly.
With the exhibition that you have opening this evening, do you think of your exhibitions as really existing in the physical space, or also having this extension into the digital, or do they have a life as well online?
I think by and large the physical exhibitions are just that, physical. I know I'm working with a number of other people on a summer show on community radio, and we're building a one person, dedicated person, St. Dylan, is building an online historical timeline that will give people a way to experience it that aren't physically there. But I think by and large the physical is how the exhibitions exist.
Usually our exhibitions are physical, and when we make publications, that's the thing that lives beyond the exhibition, not necessarily.
So you don't take.
We take some pictures. I mean, I firmly believe in making things accessible digitally. I absolutely believe in that. Especially like in my day job where I work with K-12 students, helping them do research in archives. They're not going to do research in archives if they have to come to the archive. So teaching them how to do research online through archival materials, that's how it happens. But for us, logistically that hasn't been 100% feasible, but I also had a conversation with a group of people who have all been really dedicated to our online catalog and interference archive, and I've put in a ton of work on that over the years. And we were interviewed for a book project. It's a really terrific book that came out last year, called Human Operators, looking at librarians interacting with technology. It's by Melissa Marone. And one of the people who's done a lot of work on our catalog, he just said, well, you guys, come on, like all the physical material is going to exist longer than these digital files. You know, we are doing all this work and it is for a good purpose to create this digital access, but the posters will exist longer than this online cataloging system. And it was like this moment of like, oh, thanks for reminding me of that. But I mean, thank goodness the posters will live longer. Thank goodness.
Well, can we talk a little bit more then about the way print publications operate? With your organizations, recently I was doing research on Samizdat publications, and in the MoMA library it led me to find this pamphlet from an exhibition that was at Franklin Furnace decades ago, and I was thinking how that then became this material record that's now an archive that also helps construct the history of Samizdat as well as your organizational history. And you both brought materials from Interference Archive to share. I hope you'll tell this fun story about the poster for the exhibition and how that was made. But just thinking about the way, and you spoke about this a little bit already with this book project, the way that print sort of extends the life of the exhibition or makes visible in different ways the materials that are in the or archive.
What I think is exciting, but that I'm hearing from all of you, is that everybody is trying to activate the archive. Everybody is trying to get it out in different ways to meet the public, to meet its community, to create its community, and do the work that it can do. And I think there's just multiple, I mean, again, as I said, there's, I sort of struggle with the issue around physical publications because they're very expensive too, and sincerely time consuming. So, and then how do you distribute them, and then who is the audience for them? So, but I think what we're doing is we're trying all sorts of things, and perhaps there's lots of different audiences out there that are going to engage our treasures in different ways. So as you were saying, the children are going to, everybody does things on a laptop, children are going to access it digitally, and hopefully the digital will continue in a different form, but it will continue out there. Exhibitions, the direct experience is very exciting, to engage something for the first time, but it also allows curators to create new stories around it, and I think that's something that's very exciting. Publications clearly has an audience. Look at all these books, and yet at the same time, I sometimes worry that we kind of fetishize this object, and really is it? Well, it has a life, and you might stumble upon it, but how many people really do? Is that the best way to get things out and about? I think the idea of the podcast is awesome.
Yeah.
As another,
Time consuming.
yeah. As another, but there are other audiences that you're potentially able to. So, it's like, throwing things out into, and trying to see what works.
Yeah, it's easy for publications or podcasts to just feel like a vanity project that we're just producing for ourselves. But the hope is that even if it's a very limited audience of a dozen or a few dozen or two, that someone will get something out of it because they couldn't physically attend it, or they didn't know that it was happening, or they hadn't heard of this organization or whatever we're profiling at the time. So we do it because we can.
Yeah. And I think, I don't know about you all, but we generally find that folks don't instinctively think it's going to be fun to go to an archive. But if you do an exhibition, then they come and they realize, oh, hey, this is such an interesting history and I could take that box off the shelf and learn more about it. Or I'm really interested in this type of material. I've never seen zines before. Maybe I want to come back and just hang out on a Saturday afternoon and look at zines. So, and then I think it's the same thing with the podcast. There are folks who have listened to the podcast and then shown up at the archive because they're like, hey, I didn't realize that this could all be so interesting and there was so much more to learn about it. So now I'll come to an archive because we've done these other things.
Do you create print publications or pamphlets in relation to your digital exhibitions, or does that not make sense?
Not anymore.
Yeah. But at some point, were you doing that?
Yes.
You were making
We
print
were doing
pamphlets for digital
catalogs
exhibitions.
well, no. For the first 20 years, when we were in real time and space, we were making catalogs and shipping shows around the world and doing stuff that the museum actually would be doing. And then we went virtual. In the wake of the culture wars, we decided that was the next free zone to take. And even though we had gone virtual, we kept doing publications, and then after a while we gave up.
Do you have a sense that you engage audiences differently now that you're fully online with those?
Now we are thinking about how will this ephemeral practice be preserved for 100 years. We're all going to be dead. How is this going to be available? And so we decided to partner with an educational institution so that people would write their MA theses about dynasty handbag, and that would, keep the ephemeral practice in the art history books.
So on that question of engagement, and maybe this is the last question before opening it up to everyone else, how do you get a sense that, so you mentioned a little bit that the archive encourages people to come into the space and use the archive, the exhibitions encourage people to come in and use the archive further, or you have this reading room. This was an interesting distinction which I hadn't thought of that you made between what can be a reading room and what can be a library. How do you sort of get on a kind of day-to-day basis, how much are you sort of interfacing with the public?
We'll be back to you.
16,842 page views last year.
Oh, wow.
I mean, clearly, our web presence is more visited than our physical presence. So, that's just the facts. And clearly, it's visited by much broader audiences because it's available here. You can look at what we do in Hong Kong here and what's happening here in Hong Kong. So that is incomparable in some ways. And yet the physical visitors, as we always talk to our funders about, stay longer. Those who have made the journey to Hong Kong, or those who are committed to do research at the archive. And as you know, they will be there, and they will be there for extended periods of time. And then what happens is that they're often curators, so they'll go off and use the material to curate an exhibition, or they're writers, and they'll go off and use the material to write a book or to teach a class. So so that leverage we get is not so much is through an intermediary, let's put it that way. So when we talk in this, I see some nodding faces. When you talk to people about actual foot traffic, it's not that large. But I think the impact of what we've done, I'd like to believe, is being felt in many different spheres in terms of raising the visibility around contemporary practice, particularly contemporary practice that is not necessarily circulating in the art market, which is what most people see here. So I think there is an impact, but it's harder to explain than just eyeballs or foot
Yeah.
traffic.
When people come to Interference Archive to do scholarly research, they want to write a paper about a movement or an action that occurred.
Definitely, we get those people doing scholarly research. We also get organizers coming in who say, I want to make a poster for this housing movement that I'm part of. I want to see what other people have done, what other symbols folks have used, slogans I can borrow. And we see a lot of foot traffic now that we're in a storefront space. We were in this warehouse space where you had to know that we were there in order to come. You had to ring a doorbell, and then someone would come. And sometimes people would start to walk away, so we'd go answer the door and yell down the block. And now people just wander in. Another thing that was a really interesting change between spaces. Originally, we had rented a small room, and all the collections were in there. And then as the archive grew in 2013, another adjacent space, just down the hallway in the same building, was rented, and that became the event and exhibition space. So there were people who would come to events or to exhibitions and have a great time and leave and not realize that there was a whole archive collection. They thought the archive was in the name because Interference Archive sounds cool, but they didn't realize that there was a physical collection, and that was really annoying. But there were also people who would come to do research and not see that there was a really exciting exhibition up just across the hall. So we really hoped that when we moved, those things would be in the same place, and they are now. But it's integrating exhibitions and collections has its own other special challenges. There's people who walk into the new space and they're like, oh, I'm so excited to visit your new space. Are you guys still doing exhibitions? And I'm like, it's on the walls all around you. There's also shelves of boxes, but there's also walls covered with exhibition material. So that's a whole different shift that people have to figure out. But we see a lot of in-person engagement. I feel like you can speak better to digital engagement because I don't have a good sense of podcast listenership, except I think it's big. I talk to people from all over.
I would lower your expectations. Maybe twice this round. But no, it's probably a little more. But it's been a good way for people to learn more about the space. When I reach out to people, I'll send them a link to a podcast. Sorry, when I reach out to people about an exhibition that we're putting on to try and see if we can borrow materials or see if they have anything to donate or what have you, we'll include a link to the podcast, and that's an easy way for people to engage beyond just seeing a still photo or visiting the website. So it served a purpose in that sense. In terms of additional community engagement, we offer the space to other organizations. Across the street, there's is it CAE?
Yeah, the Center for Anti-Violence Education. And their space isn't accessible. They're on a second floor with no elevator. So we have an ADA space, and
so we'll offer
they use it sometimes.
To spaces like that and other organizations that may not have a physical space, and you'd be surprised by the kind of people that visit afterward because of things like that. So.
Do you catalog every single piece of paper that comes in the door?
It's a work in progress, but it's not all cataloged. I can come to that.
Definitely not folder level.
Yeah.
Box level.
The thing that actually terrifies me a bit is we have this online catalog, and I always think no one looks at it, right? But it hasn't been linked from our website for a while because we did this software migration, and there's this is boring, but there's a bunch of issues with like the metadata populating correctly now. So it's online. It's just not accessible from our website. And all these people are emailing being like, I'm trying to find your online catalog. I want to look at this thing. And I'm like, do that many people actually want to look at our online catalog? And they reference having looked before. So people look at our online catalog. But it's scary because it's such a small portion of our collection that I don't want people to think that's representative of our collection. So great that people look at it, but yeah, it's not all there.
Well, I'm really curious about cataloging, but I'll put that there. What the rest of you?
Questions, comments, reactions.
Concerns, complaints.
There must be reactions.
I'll ask a question.
Yes.
Hi. Are you all, when you're digitizing material online, are you going for quantity, making as much accessible as possible to a wide audience as possible? Or are you treating certain materials or objects in specialized ways to make them, is it quantity or quality, I guess? Is that, what's the?
Oh, we'd like to believe that making those kinds of judgments are complicated, let's put it that way. We try to put as much as available, as much as we can online, but obviously we will prioritize. And there's certain things that we can't put online that may be more important, like private letters and things like that, which are actually extremely insightful. I mean, bring incredible insights into relationships between people. So it's a complicated equation, but we try to make as much available as possible. And we then are very interested, and it goes to the issue of activating, is inviting people in to use the material so that they can decide what is important. And artists will come in and find things that we have completely overlooked, whereas scholars will come in with research projects that wouldn't have occurred to us. And so I think it's important, at least from our perspective, yes, of course, as we said, we have content priorities that kind of act as our guide, sort of give us a sense of a compass through this vast area and this vast amount of material. But I really think it's important this issue around accessibility is really important, because I think we don't know what you might find exciting and interesting. And that, in my mind, is some of the biggest surprises and some of the most satisfying moments I've had in working with the archive.
How do you all deal, I'm just thinking of that question of like quantity and quality, how do you all deal with the massive file sizes that you must have to wrestle with?
We have a sort of central digital repository for our video. It's just like what do you call it, like a direct attached storage RAID device. So right now we've got 2 of them because we got too big for the one. And so we got one with larger hard drives, and we're going to basically migrate all the data over to that larger one. But we just have to keep moving to bigger and bigger storage to accommodate. And we apply for grants to pay for the storage.
And when we got an NEH grant to digitize our first decade, 76 to 86. And then we got another one to do 86 to 96. And we do a viewing copy, a master copy, what are all the terms there?
So yeah, there's like a preservation, I'm trying to remember what they call it in, we just started using new terms for it, but we have something that's an uncompressed master, which is the straight up scan, using the same like scanner profile. And then we have a working master, which is a converted file where we've done maybe changed the color profile. And then we have a viewing copy, which is like a very high quality copy that you could send to someone if they wanted to use it in a publication perhaps. And then a reference copy, which is low quality for web only, and then thumbnail. Pretty exciting stuff.
Well, piggybacking on what you said, Jean, about not knowing like how people will use the materials once they come in here, I think that really underscores the importance of making it clear, and also what you're talking about with your previous space having hard to access it, making clear to people that they're welcome to come inside and to use the space, and how do you sort of signal that digitally and make something visible there that brings someone into that physical space or continue to research online. And also just making sure that you're reaching the wider communities that you're trying to address with the work that you're doing, the materials you're archiving.
In terms of reaching the community both online and physically, I guess online, as Trin was saying, we can remove the link for the digital archive if we don't want people to know it's there. But it's a storefront, so we can put the sign out. People walk by. It's right by a school. Plenty of parents and kids have gone by. But we also try and engage with the community through sometimes just like podcasts. I did a social justice tour in Gowanus just down the street, so tagged along for that. Sometimes it's doing a vigil for an unfortunate accident nearby. Sometimes it's for anything.
Yeah, I feel like we do a lot more in-person engagement, and I think that's not to say we don't have a broader networks, but I think the network that we interact with around the globe in terms of the radical spaces that we see as our comrades around the globe have focused less on digital networks and more on word of mouth, and so it really is people coming in or sometimes sending an email because they'll say I visited this space in Tokyo or in London and they told me to come see you. So it feels like we have a very broad network that is less digital. At the same time, there are people who like send angry emails if I forget to put every single event as a Facebook event. So there are people who really, really love digital engagement on specific digital platforms. And that's how they want to share it with their communities and their friends. And so we try to do some of that, but I feel like we're better at the in-person stuff.
Can I ask a question? Because in Hong Kong, a few years ago, you might be aware there was something called the Umbrella Movement, which was sort of an Occupy protest movement that brought together a lot of concerns that are continuing to affect the situation in Hong Kong as it has become more and more apparent that the mainland Chinese influence and control is beginning to perhaps limit some of the sort of civic space. So there was this umbrella movement, which was these kids got out on the streets and actually occupied Central, which was the main business district, and then another section of the city. And what was really interesting about that, and your decision to sort of just collect multiples, is there was just such amazing work being done by these kids in different forms and there's been a lot of discussion about how to archive that, or whether to archive that, or what it means to archive a protest. And obviously the government institutions don't want to take that on, or at the moment, from what I understand, that there isn't a lot of activity in that area. And so some of the material, which has been made out of Post-its or made out of lots of sort of ephemeral materials, I mean banners and sort of handmade stuff is sitting in various different private hands or different places. And not a lot of multiples were actually made at the time because that wasn't what was in the minds of the people at that time. I mean, maybe there are, but I just don't. How do you make the decisions? It's just to. And are there archives for? I mean, I've always kind of worried about what's happening to the material that emerged, this creativity that emerged in Hong Kong at that time, as a placeholder for that moment, but also just as a. Are there archives for that kind of material? And tell me a little bit about your decision just to do multiples.
I'm having difficulty thinking of other spaces.
Well, one thing that is happening that I think is really interesting is I think a lot of mainstream archives are collecting that stuff. I mean, you think of the Smithsonian collecting all the pizza boxes from Occupy Wall Street, like that
Museum
stuff
of the City of
is.
New York took a lot of stuff from Occupy Wall Street. Too.
Yeah, and Time Movement took a lot, and like Brooklyn Historical Society collected signs from the Women's March, and so, but we didn't take signs from the Women's March unless they were produced in multiples. One thing that often happens with like signs that are taken out to marches is they get really dirty and we can't clean them, and so that's going to endanger the rest of our collection. And so yeah, there's some like tricky boundaries around there. I had the same thing several years ago. Before I lived in New York, I was living in South Africa, right around the time of a big miners' strike, and I was trying to find some stuff to bring to Interference Archive, but I was not seeing any flyers, any posters, anything. So finally I asked some friends who were more involved with the activity going on. I was like, well, what are people taking to these demonstrations? And they were like, oh, they're taking traditional weapons. And I was like, what? I'm not gonna get one of those in my suitcase. You know, like that doesn't go in most archives. But those were the symbols of protest. They were taking like their pine guns and things like that. So where do those things go? There are, you know, maybe other archives that collect that material, or sometimes I think archives that focus more on video documentation, capture things like that in other ways. But yeah.
No, I appreciate it.
It's tricky.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and in terms of your question of why we only collect multiples, it's things like found objects. We can't conserve those. We don't have the technical know-how or funding or hours to deal with that. Same with personal materials. The reason we don't do an oral history, why we do a podcast, not oral history, is oral histories you can put limits on what people can listen to. So if I have an hour-long chat with you, you can be like, oh, I don't want anyone to hear this part for like 80 years until I'm dead, whatever comes first. But we don't have the manpower to be able to actually put those restrictions in place. Same with manuscripts and other like personal objects. So.
So that's why you don't do oral histories?
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, and we had someone a few years back who wanted to donate an oral history collection, but they said, like, very understandably, we want all the participants to be able to say what restrictions they want to theirs, and to be able to change their minds about that. And we, as an all-volunteer space, cannot make that kind of guarantee. Like, we absolutely agree that that's how it should be managed, and that we're not the space for it. So we gave them a lot of suggestions about where to take that, but we're not the space for it. Yeah.
Same with copyright restrictions.
Other questions?
For the archive, digital archive, can you do like the viewers and analysis, like the visitor, like the
Yes, you definitely
yeah.
can.
So it can be a guide to like the better outreach for programs.
That's interesting. You mean just responding to visitor demand in a sense, so looking at the visitor numbers to see what people are actually interested in.
Yeah, and what type or yeah.
That's a very good point. We do definitely track what people are interested in. We know where our visitors are coming from. Interestingly, the United States and Hong Kong, for our Hong Kong website, and the United States is like number 2, which is interesting to us, but obviously we have lots of universities. One of the issues in Asia, as perhaps you know, is that there aren't a lot of art history departments. There's not a lot of people focusing on teaching contemporary or recent art, or recent history for that matter. So a lot of the research that gets done perhaps by Asian students who come to the United States, or Western students who are looking, so we tend to be the resource for that kind of thing. But so we can tell where they're coming from, we can tell what they're looking at. Again, one of the things that we try to do, again, it's sort of a little the unknown unknowns, is to push against what people want to look for, because what they want to look for often is what they've already seen. And so how do you kind of create opportunities for people to find things that they otherwise wouldn't, or become engaged in subjects that they didn't already have a familiarity about? And so we proactively try to develop programming to raise issues, and we have to question ourselves all the time because, you know, we're human too. We're, you know, I have an interest in such and such, so I'm the one who's going to be lobbying for that, and somebody else does. But what we need to always ask ourselves is what we're not seeing. And I think we want to kind of create that ethos within the nature of the kind of programming we do, so that people will be surprised and hopefully will find things that interest them that they may not have already interested them. China, frankly, is the one that most people want to come and look at in terms of the, and while we love China, we love to expose other parts of Asia and put them perhaps in dialogue with China, or put China in dialogue with other parts of Asia. And we do that by doing programming that brings different parts of Asia together, whether through art writing, periodicals, issues around women, issues around gender, trying to create these kind of cross dialogues. But we kind of have to push it.
A related comment that I worked at a museum, but from your question, I worked at a museum once where we take the audio guides and look at what people listen to the most, and then make the merch in the gift shop tailored to which is really smart, because that's what people are going to pay attention to. But yeah, I mean, that's a bigger issue with like the internet and everything, with news consumption, and just we're only receiving what you or the algorithm already knew you were interested in.
Yeah.
So obviously with all of the issues of offline, you can like avoid algorithm finding.
I was gonna say, I think we see like an interesting like algorithm appearing in our collections because our collection is all donated. That means that it represents what people are already interested in, right? And every now and then we'll do an exhibition of recent donations. And I remember there was one year where it was like, oh wow, look how much material we received this year that was either about anti-nuclear organizing or solidarity with Nicaragua. It was like, that was everything that came in that year, because there were a lot of people who had been active in those movements and were downsizing and cleaned out under their beds. But then it made us step back and think, well, what is like, that means if we do this show, all those people are going to come because they're interested, that's what they've been involved in, but what does that mean about who isn't in our community? And how do we fix that? And what does that mean also about maybe the material that we don't know how to look out for to get into our collection? So yeah, I feel like those, we don't know how to analyze website traffic, but we see algorithms appearing in other ways. We do know how to analyze website traffic.
I think blind spots. I'm always saying, you know, how do we, you know, where are our blind spots? I mean, think about, Martha and I are a little older than, but when I think about the kinds of things these are, you know, I thought about then and I think about now, and how do we see our own blind spots if we're actually blind to them?
Yeah, like we're aware that we don't have a good representation of materials outside of the Roman alphabet because none of us really know how to catalog that. Or it's things like the Nicaraguan stuff you were saying that comes from a lot of white people who were active in that in the 80s, but not necessarily, if I even have that historically accurate. That doesn't even, that doesn't really necessarily represent what other cultures were concerned with at the same time. So,
Well, how much does your volunteer format sort of help inform that based on who you have volunteering in the space, helping to address some of those gaps?
well, it helps and hinders because, as we've mentioned, it's all volunteer-based, which means you have to have the free time, which means you are probably, well, no, we definitely have parents in it, but it's someone who has the free time to do it, which a lot
Someone
of
who
people
doesn't
don't.
have to have two jobs,
Yeah.
basically. Yeah, which is, you know, that's just like a specific segment of New York City. And it also, I mean, there, as you said, there's pluses and minuses. A few years ago, a volunteer wanted to do a mini exhibit on disabilities activism, and we were like, oh, there's not much in the collection. Huh. There was enough to do an exhibit, and it was a great exhibit, but I think that made a few of us start paying more attention to where we can find that material. So yeah, it's hard to identify your blind spots, but it's important, I think, to figure out how.
So I think we have to wrap it up for time, but thank you so much to all of you for
Thank you.
participating.
Thank you, Megan.